This video is brought to you by Brilliant. At first glance, it looks like Argentina's president, Javier Milei, has been having a great couple of weeks. On May 14th, Argentina's statistical authority announced that month-on-month inflation had fallen to 8.8% in April. And a week later, a triumphant Milei appeared on stage at Buenos Aires' famous Luna Park Stadium to launch his new book, where he belted out a rock song that included the lyrics, "I'm the king and I will destroy you." However, at the same time that Milei was belting out rock songs, the Argentine peso's unofficial rate was collapsing, undermining Milei's plans to unify Argentina's currency and potentially reigniting inflation, which is still running at an annual rate of nearly 300%. So in this video, we're going to take another look at Milei's ongoing economic experiment, why the peso is collapsing, and what this means for Milei politically. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. So, as we see it, Milei has broadly three objectives. The first is a short-term economic objective, to stabilize Argentina's economy. The second is a more long-term economic objective, to dollarize the Argentinian economy. And the third is a political objective, to remain sufficiently popular throughout all of this in order to stay in office, which is something that previous Argentinian reformers have struggled to do. Anyway, to understand the peso's collapse, we need to start with the first objective, stabilizing the Argentinian economy. In effect, this involves doing three things. Firstly, cutting the fiscal deficit, i.e. making sure that the government spends less than it takes in tax revenues. Secondly, cutting the current account deficit, i.e. making sure that Argentina doesn't import more than it exports, which it has done historically. And third and finally, bringing down inflation, which has been a chronic problem for Argentina for most of modern history. Now, to his credit, Milei has made pretty good progress towards balancing the fiscal deficit. Thanks to various cuts, government spending has fallen by over 10%, allowing Argentina to run its first quarterly surplus since 2008. Although it's worth noting that the surplus fell from roughly 700 million to 300 million in April, as weak growth took its toll on tax revenues. However, balancing the current account has proved more difficult. The main way that Milei wants to do this is by devaluing and unifying the peso. For context, Argentina currently has basically two exchange rates: the official rate claimed by the government and the unofficial or actual rate, known as the blue rate, which is basically always lower than the official rate. Before Milei took charge, for instance, the official rate was about 370 to the dollar, while the unofficial rate was about 1,000 to the dollar. To unify these two rates, in December, Milei cut the official rate to 800 to the dollar and said that he would devalue it by a further 2% every month until it matches the unofficial rate, which he's since done. Now, Milei hopes that a unified, albeit weaker peso will eventually reduce the current account deficit by reducing imports and encouraging foreign investment. But the immediate effect of the devaluation was a spike in inflation. Year-on-year inflation, i.e. the change in prices relative to a year ago, jumped above 200% in December and is now running at nearly 300%, the highest in the world. Now, usually when inflation is high, countries increase their interest rates. However, Milei has instead been cutting rates. This is in part because he doesn't want to exacerbate the ongoing recession or discourage investment, but it's mainly because of the vast quantity of short-term interest-bearing liabilities, known as LELIQs, currently held by Argentina's central bank. Now, LELIQs are basically like central bank bonds that mature very quickly, with interest rates that match the central banks. Because of this, they're basically the safest asset in Argentina, and safer than government bonds, which makes them ridiculously popular. And LELIQs today represent around 10% of GDP and are 3 times Argentina's entire monetary base. Now, when interest rates go up, the central bank has to pay out a whole load more money to creditors via those LELICs, which means more money in the system and therefore higher inflation. Lower rates therefore also paradoxically help lower inflation in Argentina's case, and also make it cheaper for the Argentinian government to buy up these LELICs, something that Milei wants to do. Now, originally it looked like this strategy was working. Despite cutting rates from a high of 126% in December to just 50% in mid-May, month-on-month inflation, i.e. the change in prices relative to a month ago, fell steadily, reaching a new low of 8.8% in April. The day after this data was published, Milei optimistically cut rates by another 10% to a 2-year low of 40%, having cut them from 60 to 50% just a day earlier. However, a week after, the peso's unofficial rate began sliding, falling from about 1,100 to the dollar at the beginning of the week to nearly 1,300 by Thursday. Now, this is by no means a disaster, given that it's mostly an unsurprising reaction to the steep interest rate cuts, which have made it even less attractive to hold pesos. Nonetheless, it's a worrying sign for Milei for 3 reasons. Firstly, the widening gap between the official and unofficial rates will make it harder for Milei to unify the peso. Second, other analysts have suggested that it might also reflect investors' anxieties about Milei's legislative struggles. For context, because Milei's party only hold about 15% of the seats in Congress, he's struggled to pass some of his more controversial reforms. Now, he's been able to get a surprising amount done via presidential decree, and last month finally got a watered-down version of his omnibus bill through the lower house. But the bill still faces staunch opposition in the Senate, and Milei has failed to negotiate a much-anticipated deal with Argentina's powerful provincial governors. But thirdly, a declining currency risks reigniting inflation. So far, ordinary Argentinians have been remarkably tolerant of Milei's policy program, despite the fact that it exacerbated both inflation and poverty. Morning Consult polling from April, for instance, suggests that Milei's approval ratings have held strong around 60% since his inauguration, making him one of the most popular leaders in the world. And polling from Argentinian think tank Economia suggests that even among the half of Argentines struggling to make ends meet, 30% still support Milei. This is in part because they accept that radical reform is required, but also because Milei touts the declining monthly inflation rate as proof that things are getting better. And last month promised in an interview with Time magazine that Argentina's recovery will be V-shaped and that the country is currently at the bottom of the V. If inflation persists, however, public patience could wane, and Milei risks suffering the same fate as previous Argentinian reformers. And this is actually an acute concern, given that last week Milei laid out his new plan for dollarization, proposing that, instead of doing it all at once, Milei would let the dollar and peso circulate at the same time, and then let the dollar slowly overwhelm the peso. While this is in some sense more feasible, given that it doesn't require an enormous pre-prepared store of dollars to buy up all the pesos, letting the two currencies circulate at the same time will almost definitely put more downward pressure on the peso. All in all, while the peso's decline isn't catastrophic, it's something worth keeping an eye on, especially if Milei tries to dollarize anytime soon. When making videos like this, we rely on tons of data analysis to interpret crucial economic data and understand political decisions. But this kind of analysis isn't just crucial for our jobs. As work becomes more driven by AI and data, your job will likely require more analytical skills too. And that's why we've been using Brilliant. Brilliant is the STEM learning platform that can teach you all the skills you need in an increasingly digital workplace. They've just introduced a whole collection of new programming and LLM courses, suitable for learners at any level, taking you through everything from learning Python to understanding the importance of training data. And Brilliant isn't just about memorization and lectures. Brilliant teaches you by doing, using active learning techniques to teach you the principles behind otherwise quite complex topics, and ensuring that you actually understand what's going on, with thousands of interactive lessons in maths, data analysis, programming, and AI. Now, all of Brilliant's courses are split into easy-to-digest chunks, meaning that you can quickly and easily gain a real knowledge in just a few minutes a day, with fun lessons that you can do whenever you have time, replacing mindless scrolling on the bus or waiting for coffee with something stimulating and rewarding. To gain access to Brilliant for a full 30 days, head to brilliant.org/TLDR or click the link in the description. That way, you'll get 20% off an annual premium subscription, and they'll know that you came from us, which really helps us out. So thanks to Brilliant for sponsoring this video, and thanks to you for your support.